So I'm using the Forest Ecology and Silvics rubric that you'll find on D2L, and I'm going to try to kind of work way through this rubric and mark as I'm speaking, so you can kind of get a sense on what I'm looking for in an interview. Okay, the site example that we're going to use is Site 4 that we visited down at Northumberland County Forest, and that site, according to Big Blue, for reference purposes, that forest type. Oh shoot, sorry. That forest type was a pine coniferous stand. The majority of the overstory was white pine and red pine, with balsam fir coming up in the understory, kind of as a co-dominant feature. So, given the population of conifers in general outweighing the deciduous, puts it in a coniferous forest, and of course, so much of it being Pinus strobus and Pinus resinosa, it would mean that it would be a pine forest stand. Um, Associated herbaceous species. When we were walking through there, that site was extremely thick with poison ivy, and you could see it jumping up through the snow. That much poison ivy, that thick, usually is an indicator that there's a lot of open sunlight hitting the forest floor, making it the poison ivy that much thicker and hardy. So that, given that site, how much open sunlight there was, it would be expected that the poison ivy would be quite dominant there in the understory. Other associated herbaceous species you'd find with a pine forest that we didn't see just because of the time of year, but I would expect that you would see some bracken fern as well as spinulose wood fern. Again, just because they're often associated with these species and in the sandy soil that would have been expected on that site. Topography, the site for topography was kind of at the base of a drumlin, not influenced so much by the soil types or of a microsite that the drumlin would have caused. This was further out and away from there, but it was fairly flat, slightly sloping. Drainage, the slope really wouldn't have affected drainage, especially given that I would expect, without doing a core sample, but based on the species that we found growing there, we probably would have had a sandier soil. That would meant we had well-drained soils, probably retaining some moisture over the course of the year with a slightly higher water table, just because we were lower in elevation compared to the elevation of the drumlin that was right next to us. As far as the influence of topography, it was a fairly even and consistent topography. There wasn't a lot of opportunity for microsites, probably because historically that area specifically where we were looking at probably was tilled and used for agricultural purposes at one point before it was regenerated. So that meant that the soil would be pretty flat and consistent. Not a lot of microsite opportunities because everything would have been tilled in kind of a consistent form in the soil. Forest development based upon what we saw there. Well, currently, like I said, we have a conifer forest. You could argue it's plantation further along. I think in the past it probably was a plantation, given that they were Pinus resinosa and Pinus strobus. Resinosa, of course, needing being shade intolerant. Pinus strobus being intermediate. Typically what they require is some sort of disturbance in order for them to establish. So that an indicator for me, one, maybe there was a forest fire at one point, but the pine looked to be quite extensive across the forest, so it would have had to have been a major forest fire that wiped the whole area. Knowing the history of the Northumberland County Forest, it probably wasn't a fire, though. It probably was planted as a plantation, and now that as the forest develops, we find that plantation is looking less like a plantation and looking more like a natural forest. So the trees are more well spaced apart. When they first would have been planted, they would have been row by row as a plantation and growing up. But in the past, how that would have been the case. Today, presently, we're finding that the trees the forest is growing into is in the forest stand reinitiation stage. And so what's happening here is an evidence of that is that the spacing is quite wide now. So the most dominant trees in the canopy are starting to break up their spacing, and that means more sunlight is hitting the ground. Evidence of this is we saw stumps of trees that were removed, so the ecology is being assisted by people and by our activities. By thinning the trees, we're allowing more sunlight to hit the ground. It's at the reinitiation stage because the trees are at a maturity and at a height now that it's taking longer for them to fill in their spaces. And as it takes longer for the dominant trees to fill in the spaces, that means more sunlight goes down, hits the ground, and that can now allow new regeneration to grow in the understory of the forest. The other evidence for stand reinitiation is now we have starting to get different vertical stratification within the forest. So we have our dominant canopy of the Pinus resinosa and Pinus strobus, followed by Abies balsamifera, kind of in the understory, or you could argue in the codominants. And then down into the intermediates in the understory, we're finding more Acer cercarum now and Fagus grandifolia, all being shade-tolerant species. So, growing well on those sandy sites that we see, sandy, moist, well-drained sites, shade-tolerant, they are emerging and going to grow in the understory quite well of this forest type. So that was the past. It was probably plantation through thinning of the forest and management. We've encouraged stand reinitiation to take place, and now we're finding these shade-tolerant species growing in the understory. So this would appear in the future now that probably what's going to happen is the Pinus resinosa and Pinus strobus that we see in the overstory, they are long-lived trees. They can live hundreds of years. So, barring no major disturbance that's going to cause a windstorm that's going to cause uprooting or a forest fire, even with a forest fire, these mature pines probably would be able to handle certain levels of forest fires to a degree because they are fire-resistant species as well. So some will survive, continue to grow and become emergents super canopy trees, and that's going to provide better roosting habitat, nesting habitat for rare raptors such as bald eagles. Is probably providing nesting for some raptors such as red-tailed hawk and things now. In the understory, we're probably going to be seeing white-tailed deer. There will be some black bear make their way down because of the large tract of forest that Northumberland County is. So there will be some possibility of black bear using this forest type as well. And as the forest continues to develop, we see evidence of the shade-tolerant trees, the American beech, sugar maples. They're going to be filling in and becoming the new canopy, 100 years down the road. And also the balsam fir, although not as long-lived, certainly on a forest site, in a sandy site like this, they are going to be competitive, and because of their ability to react so quickly and so well to release when the canopy is opened up, they're going to continue to be quite dominant on this site in the future as well. Considering impact of disturbance, right now what we're seeing is the forest being thinned just through regular forest management. So they've thinned the canopy, and the species being shade tolerant that are coming up generally do respond quite well to disturbance. They have American beech, sugar maple, and balsam fir all have the ability to stay in the understory for numerous years, some up to 30 years, and be able to release quite well at that point and become quite dominant. And that's according to information in Big Blue. Influence of soil and moisture, that was kind of covered earlier, but again, it was expected to be a fairly sandy site, and again, that's going to not hold the moisture well. It's going to flow through the soil, so keeping the soil moist but well drained. Moist because the water table will be slightly higher since it was a lower elevation than some of the neighboring topography around that. Okay, and just to review and make sure I've kind of covered all the steps. Yeah, that covers everything in a nutshell. So if you can kind of give me a presentation like that, um, go down these steps and just make sure the information you have gathered, the data sheets, covers this. Make sure you're referring Big Blue. Oh, I lost a mark because I didn't mention the bird book, which I was using for reference as well. Just give me reference on where you found the information. And just speak. Again, you don't see the wildlife when we're out there. We're too loud. But look for evidence. If you can't find evidence, go to Big Blue and look at wildlife habitat observations. Look at some of the birds. The birds are the indicators of the forest. And there's lots of great information as you're going through the bird book to help you with information on that. Okay, you can use some ELC information to find out associated herbaceous vegetation. Again, poison ivy was an easy one on this site. Topography, again, think about the topography, where the trees are growing. This is a big area that I'm looking at because the forest stand dynamics, the past, present, and future. If you just talk about past, present, and future, you can incorporate all of these other things into it. The silvics, the successional stage, impacted disturbance, soil and moisture, forest type, all the sorts of things that can all come out of this area. Okay, so don't, I was all over the map too when I was saying this. You don't have to go in any particular order. I certainly didn't. That's my job, is as you are doing the presentation, I'm jumping around marking and just making notes to make sure you've covered these points. And the big thing is to answer why. Okay, you can basically say anything as long as you can justify it. Okay, if you can't justify it or back it up, then I question the relevance of that. Okay, but just be able to support your why you think the forest is the way it is. Okay, I hope this helps. Good luck.